since looking into the history, one finds out the number of deaths, the huge refugee crisis, the destruction of the infrastructure of China during that period, the real changing of Chinese society during those years. It's so transformative, not just for China, but for the entire world, that I felt that this forgotten story should at least be told a little bit more, and that stimulated me to write that book, Forgotten Ally. And I use that title quite deliberately, because I would say that if you asked most Westerners who know a lot about World War II, who were the big Allied powers, they would probably say the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. But they might not remember that China was not only one of the Allied powers, but actually the first of the Allied powers, if you count the beginning of the war, which starts in Asia before it begins in Europe. First of all, just to make a quick case about the relevance of China, I would point people to the year 1938. Why 1938? Because first of all, for most people who count the war as beginning in Europe in 1939, they should remember that actually after the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incident of 1937, 7th July, which took place just outside Beijing, actually China and Japan quickly went into all-out war. And so in Asia, 1938 is already during the war year. What is China's situation at that point? Most people, including a lot of foreign diplomats from Western countries, thought his case was hopeless. Remember, by that stage, most of the great heartland cities of China's culturally richest areas in the east and north of China were occupied. Beijing, known in those days as Beiping, Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou. These cities were essentially under Japanese occupation, and it seemed only a matter of time before clearly the Japanese were going to conquer the whole of China. Now seems like actually a good choice, because we know that in the end, China was one of the Allies, and the Allies did win the war. But in 1938, making that choice was a very risky decision. That's why I think it's important to remember that if China had not fought at that time, then actually the whole history of the war in Asia would be different. And if the history of the war in Asia is different, the history of the war in Europe and the war against Hitler will be different as well. One of the things that was most important to me in writing the book Forgotten Ally was not just to tell the stories of big name figures, but actually I think knowing about the little people, the unknown people, people whose names maybe aren't remembered, was tremendously important. Let me give you one other example of how ordinary people's lives were changed forever by that period. And that is a subject that only recently has, I think, been researched by Chinese and Western scholars, which is the refugee crisis that shaped the wartime years. People from eastern China, Nanjing, Shanghai, who had to flee from the Japanese occupation and went on boats or sometimes, taking the road upriver to Chongqing. And it often took them, weeks, if not months, to do that. And that refugee crisis, again, was one of the issues that really shaped the changing society of China at that time. I would say that hearing those voices and understanding why they had to displace themselves is an important part of that wider story. The diversity of voices reminds us that the war is about people. It is, of course, about forces, it's about ideology, it's about ideas, it's about violence. All of these things are always true of war. But above all, it's about people and their aspirations and their desires and their choices. I think it's also worth noting that on the international stage, China began to really change its position. I would say World War II is the time when China moves from being a country that is a victim on the global stage to being one of the makers of global order. And the particular example we can use comes in 1945, when China sends a delegation to San Francisco to sign the United Nations Charter. And this provides essentially the opening for China to get one of the 5 permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council with Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, and France. And many scholars, including scholars in China, are actually doing work on the way in which that post-war Chinese government actually started to shape the economic order, global order through the United Nations, Bretton Woods, which became the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Many of the things that today are still framing the international order emerged in 1945 and emerged also with real Chinese influence from people who were involved in fighting the war and wanted to shape the peace. That story of China as the wartime ally had basically dissolved in the early years of the Cold War. I think that that really changed the way in which all sides looked at each other. Remember, in 1945, China was a wartime ally of the United States. Japan was the enemy that had just been defeated in World War II. Just 5 years later, very short period of time, the positions were exactly reversed. Japan was now a firm Cold War ally of the United States, and China didn't even have diplomatic relations with the United States. So that meant that hearing about the Chinese wartime experience did not find an obvious audience in the United States. I do think Western perceptions have changed and are continuing to change. So let's take the example of museums. If you go, for instance, to the National World War II Museum in Louisiana in the United States, or to the Imperial War Museum in London, you will now find displays which do talk, quite extensively actually, about China's wartime role. And I think those displays would not have been there 20, 25 years ago. So I would say that yes, it is changing. But is there more work to do? Yes, there is. The history of that period and of China's wartime experience is just still less well covered, less well known in the outside world than perhaps Western Europe, North Africa, the Pacific War, all of which I think have been more extensively covered. It's impossible to understand the nature of contemporary order, which is changing very fast these days, without understanding the role that China has played in that history really ever since the 1930s and 1940s. Its resistance in the 1930s was crucial to keeping an Asian battlefield open against the Japanese at a time when it would have been possible to surrender and the whole path of global war would have been different. That is worth remembering, but I think that it's not well enough understood. So even in a very different age today, 80 years after the end of World War II, I think it's important to remember China's role, but understand also the many complex and in some ways, I think, still under-examined aspects of those histories that still deserve further historical examination.